The Texas frontier of 1858 was a place where life hung by a thread, and mercy was a luxury few could afford. For Sarah Callahan, a young widow homesteading alone on the edge of civilization, compassion would prove to be both her greatest risk and her most unexpected salvation. When she discovered a gravely wounded Comanche boy collapsed near her property, she made a choice that defied every frontier instinct. She brought him into her home. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 days later, as dawn broke across the horizon, 60 Comanche warriors appeared on the ridge above her homestead, led by the boy's father, a feared war chief whose name struck terror throughout the territory. What happened next would become the stuff of frontier legend, a moment when the boundary between enemies dissolved in the face of something far more powerful than fear or vengeance. The summer of 1858 in the Texas Hill Country had been brutal, even by frontier standards. 4 months of drought had turned the rolling landscape into a sun-baked wasteland. Creeks that once flowed freely were now nothing more than cracked mud, and the relentless heat shimmered off the horizon like waves from an invisible sea. Sarah Callahan stood on the porch of her modest cabin, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of crimson and gold. At 26, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical braid and hands calloused from years of hard work, she embodied the quiet resilience needed to survive on the frontier. The homestead had been her husband Thomas's dream, 40 acres of promising land nestled between a gentle slope and a year-round spring that hadn't yet succumbed to the drought. Thomas had been gone for 2 years now, taken by a fever that swept through the scattered settlements like wildfire. Many had urged Sarah to return east to her family in Pennsylvania, or at least to the relative safety of Austin. But the stubborn streak that Thomas had always admired wouldn't allow her to abandon what they had built together. One more season, she whispered to herself, a promise repeated so often it had become a prayer. If the rains didn't return by fall, she would have to reconsider her options. The cattle were struggling, and her vegetable garden produced barely enough to sustain her, let alone provide anything to trade with passing supply wagons. As twilight deepened into darkness, Sarah completed her evening routine. She checked the barn, where her 2 horses and 3 remaining cows sought shelter from the heat, secured the chicken coop against predators, and ensured her rifle was loaded and within reach, a necessary precaution in a territory where Comanche raids had increased as drought pushed both settlers and natives to desperation. The Comanche were the undisputed masters of the southern plains. Their skill as horsemen was legendary. Their raiding parties feared from Texas to Mexico. The drought had disrupted the delicate balance of territory that had existed for generations, and tensions between settlers and natives escalated with each. The passing month, Sarah was acutely aware of her vulnerability. The nearest neighbor, the Wilkins family, lived 5 miles to the east, and Fort Mason was a full day's ride south. She had learned to sleep lightly, attuned to every unfamiliar sound that might signal danger. That night, a distant thunderstorm teased the parched land with the promise of rain that never materialized. Lightning illuminated the landscape in brief, stark flashes revealing the familiar contours of her property in ghostly snapshots. It was during one such flash, as Sarah gazed out her window before retiring, that she glimpsed something unusual near the edge of her property, where the land sloped down to the spring. Morning came with the harsh clarity typical of Texas summers, the air already warm despite the early hour. Sarah rose before dawn, as was her habit, and the memory of what she'd seen the previous night tugged at her consciousness. After feeding the chickens and milking the cows, she grabbed her rifle and headed toward the spring. The path to the water source was well worn, a daily journey essential to her survival. The spring itself was a small miracle, a clear pool nestled among limestone rocks that somehow continued to provide water even as larger creeks and rivers dried up throughout the region. As she approached, the glint of sun on metal caught her eye. What she discovered changed everything. Partially hidden among the tall grasses was a boy, no more than 12 or 13 years old. His copper skin and long black hair immediately identified him as Comanche. He wore a simple breechcloth, and his chest was decorated with protective symbols painted in faded ochre. But what drew Sarah's immediate attention was the arrow protruding from his side and the alarming amount of blood that had soaked into the earth beneath him. The boy's eyes fluttered open at her approach, fear and defiance warring in his gaze. He attempted to reach for a knife at his waist, but the movement caused him to grimace in pain, and his arm fell limply to his side. Sarah's mind raced. Every frontier instinct screamed for her to retreat immediately. A wounded Comanche youth meant a war party somewhere nearby. The smart move would be to return to her cabin, gather essential supplies, and ride for Fort Mason as quickly as possible. Yet something held her in place. Perhaps it was the memory of Thomas, who had always insisted that their Christian duty extended to all God's children, regardless of origin. Or perhaps it was simply the universal human response to a child in distress, transcending the boundaries of conflict and culture. The boy's breathing was shallow, his skin hot with fever. Without treatment, he would certainly die. Sarah made her decision. "I'm going to help you," she said, knowing he couldn't understand her words, but hoping her tone would convey her intentions. "Don't fight me." The journey back to the cabin was arduous. The boy weighed less than she expected, his frame lean and wiry, but he drifted in and out of consciousness, alternately cooperating and struggling weakly against her support. By the time they reached the cabin, Sarah's dress was stained with his blood, and her arms trembled with exertion. She placed him on the spare bed in the room that had once been intended for the children she and Thomas had hoped to have. The arrow was her first concern. It had entered the right side of his abdomen, but miraculously didn't appear to have struck any vital organs. The wound was infected, however, with angry red streaks extending outward from the entry point. Sarah had assisted the local doctor enough times to know what needed to be done. The arrow would have to be pushed through rather than pulled out to avoid causing further damage. She gathered her supplies: whiskey for disinfection, clean linen strips, a pot of boiled water, and the herbs she kept for medicinal purposes. "This will hurt," she told the semi-conscious boy, "but it's necessary." His eyes opened again, dark and inscrutable, watching her preparations with a mixture of suspicion and resignation. When she offered him a small amount of whiskey, he refused, closing his lips tightly and turning his head away. The procedure was as quick as Sarah could make it, but the boy's scream when she broke the arrowhead and pulled the shaft through tore at her heart. He didn't fight her, though. Whether from weakness or understanding the necessity, she couldn't tell. Once the arrow was removed, she cleaned the wound thoroughly with whiskey and herbal infusions, packed it with yarrow to stop the bleeding, and bound it tightly with clean bandages. Then came the waiting. Sarah kept vigil through the day and into the night, repeatedly wiping the boy's fevered brow with cool cloths and trying to get him to take small sips of water. She knew the next 48 hours would determine whether he lived or died. As she cared for him, questions plagued her mind. How had he come to be wounded and alone? Where was his family? And most pressingly, what would she do if he survived? The Comanche were known to value their children highly. They would surely be searching for him. If they found him here, would they understand she had tried to help, or would they see only a settler who had taken one of their children? The night passed in fitful intervals of sleep and wakefulness. By morning, the boy's fever had not broken, but neither had it worsened. Sarah changed his bandages, noting with relief that the wound, while angry-looking, showed no further signs of spreading infection. Throughout the day, she alternated between caring for the boy and attending to essential chores, always with one eye on the horizon. Every distant dust cloud, every unusual sound brought her heart to her throat. She kept her rifle closer than ever. The boy remained largely unconscious, occasionally mumbling words in his native tongue that Sarah couldn't understand. During one lucid moment, she attempted to communicate, pointing to herself and saying, "Sarah." The boy regarded her silently, offering nothing in return. By nightfall of the second day, a small breakthrough occurred. The boy's fever broke, leaving him weak but more alert. When Sarah brought him a thin broth made from a chicken she had sacrificed from her dwindling flock, he accepted it cautiously, watching her with unwavering attention as she demonstrated that it was safe by taking a spoonful herself. After eating, he surprised her by pointing to himself and uttering a single word, "Tabe." "Tabe," Sarah repeated, smiling slightly. "I'm Sarah." The boy nodded once, then closed his eyes, exhaustion claiming him once more. The third day brought steady improvement. Tabe was able to sit up with assistance and take more substantial nourishment. The wound was healing remarkably well, testament to the resilience of youth and perhaps the clean living of the Comanche, whose physical prowess was respected even by their enemies. Sarah attempted simple communication through gestures and expressions. She gathered that Tabe had somehow been separated from his people during what might have been a hunting expedition. The arrow that wounded him appeared to be Comanche in design, suggesting either an accident or perhaps conflict between different bands. As Tabe regained strength, Sarah's anxiety grew. Every moment that passed increased the likelihood of discovery, either by Comanche searching for the boy or by settlers who would view her actions as nothing short of treason. The penalty for aiding natives could be severe in frontier justice, where fear often trumped compassion. She began to formulate a plan. Once Tabe was strong enough to travel, she would take him as close as she dared to known Comanche territories, and leave him with enough supplies to make his way back to his people. It was a risk, but less dangerous than keeping him longer or attempting to deliver him directly. That night, a soft rain finally fell, bringing temporary relief to the parched land. Sarah sat on her porch, listening to the gentle patter on the roof and watching lightning illuminate distant clouds. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to believe that both she and Tabe might emerge from this situation unscathed. The sound woke her before dawn on the fourth day. The soft nicker of horses, not her own, approaching with deliberate slowness. Sarah bolted upright in the chair where she had fallen asleep, instantly alert. Through the grey pre-dawn light, she could make out mounted figures on the ridge above her property, at least 20 visible and likely more beyond her line of sight. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Comanche warriors. Her blood turned to ice. There was no time to run, nowhere to hide. 60 warriors could overtake her in moments, even if she had a head start. The best she could hope for was to meet her fate with dignity. With trembling hands, Sarah lit a lamp and moved to check on Tabe. The boy was already awake, his eyes wide with recognition at the sounds outside. He said something urgent in his language, gesturing toward the door. "Your people have come for you," Sarah said, the words catching in her throat. "I hope they understand I tried to help you." Steeling herself, she helped Tabe to his feet. He was still weak, but able to stand with support. Together they moved to the porch, Sarah holding the lamp high to ensure they would be clearly visible. The mounted warriors remained motionless on the ridge, silhouetted against the lightening sky. Then a single rider detached from the group and began descending toward the cabin at a measured pace. He was an imposing figure, his chest bare despite the morning chill, adorned with elaborate paint and multiple necklaces of what appeared to be bear claws and human fingers, a chilling reminder of the fate of many settlers who had crossed paths with Comanche raiders. As he drew closer, the resemblance to Taabe became apparent. The same high cheekbones, the same intensity in the eyes. This could only be the boy's father. Sarah stood her ground, one arm supporting Taabe, the other holding the lamp. She had no weapons within reach. They would have been useless anyway against such overwhelming odds. All she had was the truth, and perhaps the testimony of the boy she had saved. When the warrior was within 20 paces, he halted his horse and studied the tableau before him. The white woman and the Comanche boy standing together on the porch of a settler's cabin. His face revealed nothing of his thoughts. Taabe broke the silence, speaking rapidly in his native tongue. His father listened without interruption, his gaze never leaving Sarah's face. When the boy finished, a heavy silence descended, broken only by the soft sounds of horses shifting restlessly on the ridge above. The future hung in the balance, suspended in that fragile moment between night and day, between hostility and understanding. Sarah Callahan, the widow who had defied frontier wisdom to save a Comanche child, awaited judgment as the eastern sky gradually brightened with the promise of dawn. The war chief dismounted in one fluid motion, his movements betraying none of the tension that charged the air. Up close, his presence was even more imposing, well over 6 feet tall with shoulders broadened by years of drawing bows and wielding weapons. His face was a map of experience, deep lines etched around eyes that had witnessed both beauty and brutality on the vast Texas plains. He approached the porch with measured steps, stopping at the base of the 3 wooden stairs that led to where Sarah and Taabe stood. For several heartbeats, he simply studied Sarah, his gaze penetrating and unreadable. Then, to her astonishment, he spoke in heavily accented but understandable English. "I am Stonewolf. The boy says you pulled an arrow from him, gave him medicine, food, water." Each statement was delivered flatly, neither question nor accusation. Sarah nodded, finding her voice with effort. "Yes, he was badly wounded. I couldn't leave him to die." Stonewolf's expression remained unchanged. "Many white eyes would kill a Comanche boy, even wounded one." "I'm not many people," Sarah replied simply. The war chief's eyes narrowed slightly, perhaps in surprise at her directness. He turned to Taabe and spoke rapidly in their language. The boy responded, gesturing toward his bandaged side, and then to Sarah. At one point, he faltered, and Sarah instinctively steadied him with a gentle hand on his shoulder, an action that did not escape Stonewolf's notice. When their exchange concluded, Stonewolf returned his attention to Sarah. "My son says fever spirit was taking him. Says you fought spirit away with strong medicine. Says you did not treat him as an enemy. He's just a child," Sarah said. "There are no children who are enemies." Something shifted in Stonewolf's expression, not quite softening, but a subtle change, like sunlight breaking momentarily through storm clouds. He turned and made a single sharp gesture toward the warriors on the ridge. One rider separated from the group, leading a horse that carried what appeared to be a body. Sarah's heart sank. Had they already attacked someone nearby? Was this a warning of what awaited her? As the riders drew closer, she realized the form draped over the horse was a woman, unconscious or possibly dead. Her dress, though torn and bloodied, was clearly of European origin. Her blonde hair hung limply, partially obscuring her face. 2 suns ago, Stonewolf explained, a band of men, not Comanche, not army, maybe Comancheros, attacked a white family by Coyote Creek, kill a man, take a woman. We found them yesterday. Men drink firewater, not watch carefully. We kill them, take the woman back. The riders halted several yards from the cabin. Now Sarah could see the woman's chest, rising and falling shallowly. She was alive, but clearly injured. "She needs help," Sarah said, already moving toward the steps. Stone Wolf's hand shot out, not touching her but blocking her path. "Why do you help her? Not your family." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "For the same reason I helped your son. She needs help, and I can give it." After a long moment, Stone Wolf nodded and stepped aside. Sarah hurried to the injured woman, quickly assessing her condition. She had been beaten severely, with bruises darkening her face and arms. A gash on her forehead had crusted over with dried blood, and her breathing was labored. "Bring her inside," Sarah directed, falling naturally into the role of healer. To her surprise, Stone Wolf himself lifted the woman with unexpected gentleness and carried her toward the cabin. Once inside, Sarah directed him to place the woman on her own bed. "I need clean water, my medicine box from the shelf there, and more lamps lit," she instructed, forgetting momentarily whom she was addressing. To her astonishment, Stone Wolf related these orders in Comanche, and within moments, 2 young warriors appeared at the doorway. They hesitated, clearly uncomfortable entering a white woman's dwelling, but a sharp word from their chief sent them hurrying to fulfill Sarah's requirements. As Sarah cleaned the woman's wounds and administered what care she could, Tabe sat nearby, watching with interest. Stone Wolf stood impassively in the corner, his presence filling the small room. "Her name is Rebecca Miller," Stone Wolf offered unexpectedly. "Husband was James Miller. They built cabin near the creek 3 moons ago." Sarah nodded, recognizing the names. "I heard a new family had settled north of here, never had the chance to meet them." She paused in her work, looking up at the war chief. "You knew their names. You were watching them." Stone Wolf inclined his head slightly. "We watch all who enter our hunting grounds. Some we fight, some we leave alone if they respect the land." The implication was clear. Stone Wolf's band had allowed the Millers to establish their homestead, perhaps recognizing them as no immediate threat. Their surveillance had likely saved Rebecca's life after the attack. As morning gave way to full daylight, warriors remained positioned around Sarah's property, but their presence had shifted from threatening to vigilant. Several had dismounted, allowing their horses to graze on the sparse grass. 2 were stationed on the roof of Sarah's barn, providing a vantage point to survey the surrounding countryside. Inside, Rebecca Miller regained consciousness briefly, her eyes widening in terror at the sight of Stone Wolf before Sarah could reassure her. The woman slipped back into unconsciousness, but her breathing had steadied, and Sarah was cautiously optimistic about her recovery. "She will live," Stone Wolf stated rather than asked. "I believe so," Sarah replied, "but she'll need time to heal, both in body and spirit." Stone Wolf nodded, then turned his attention to his son. Taabe had dozed off in a chair, his young body still recovering from his ordeal. The war chief studied him with an expression that, for the first time, revealed emotion, a father's concern breaking through the warrior's mask. "He is my youngest son," Stone Wolf said quietly. "His mother walked the spirit path 2 winters ago. He tries to be a warrior too soon, follows the hunting party without permission, gets lost. Then—" He made a gesture indicating the arrow. "Wound." "An accident," Sarah ventured. Stone Wolf's expression darkened. "No accident. Kiowa hunting party. Old enemies. They do not know he is just a boy from a distance." The complexity of the frontier's conflicts came into sharper focus for Sarah. Not simply settlers versus natives, but intricate webs of alliances, enmities and territories that had existed long before white settlement began pushing westward. By midday, an unexpected scene had unfolded at the Callahan homestead. Comanche warriors stood guard around the perimeter, while others had established a temporary camp at a respectful distance from the cabin. Stone Wolf had sent riders out in various directions, scouts ensuring no threat approached during this vulnerable time. Inside, Sarah tended to both Tabe and Rebecca, moving between them with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to managing multiple responsibilities. Stone Wolf observed her work in silence, occasionally translating when she needed to. "Communicate something to Tabe. You live here alone," he said eventually. "Not a question. My husband died 2 years ago," Sarah explained, changing Rebecca's bandages. "This was our dream. I couldn't bring myself to leave." Stone Wolf nodded, understanding evident in his expression. Land holds spirit. Hard to leave a place where loved ones' spirits remain. The simple acknowledgement of her grief, coming from this unexpected source, brought a lump to Sarah's throat. She continued her work in silence for several minutes before asking, "What will happen now?" Stone Wolf considered the question carefully. "Sun is high. Not safe to move wounded yet. We stay until dawn." The implications of 60 Comanche warriors camping openly on a settler's property were not lost on Sarah. "If any other settlers or soldiers see you here, they'll assume the worst. My scouts will give warning if anyone comes. Then we decide." The chief's tone made it clear that the safety of his people, including his recovering son, was his primary concern. As the day wore on, an unexpected knock at the door startled everyone inside the cabin. Stone Wolf's hand flew to his knife, but Sarah motioned for him to stay back as she cautiously approached the door. "Sarah, you in there?" "It's Ethan Wilkins," called a familiar voice. Sarah glanced at Stone Wolf, who nodded once, his hand remaining on his weapon. She opened the door to find her nearest neighbor standing on her porch, his expression a mixture of concern and confusion. Behind him, his 16-year-old son Daniel waited nervously with the horses. Neither had yet noticed the Comanche warriors strategically positioned around the property, partially concealed by the natural features of the landscape. "Ethan," Sarah acknowledged, positioning herself to block his view into the cabin. "What brings you out this way? Passing travelers mentioned smoke from your direction. With all the raids lately, Emily insisted I check on you." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Everything all right? You seem tense." Before Sarah could formulate a response, Stone Wolf appeared silently behind her. Ethan's hand immediately went to his pistol, while young Daniel let out a strangled sound of alarm. "Don't," Sarah said sharply, placing herself between the two men. "Ethan, listen to me. This is Stone Wolf. His son was injured, and I've been helping him. They've done no harm. Here." Ethan's eyes darted between Sarah and the imposing Comanche chief, disbelief evident in his expression. "Have you lost your mind, Sarah? These savages killed the Peterson family just last month." Stone Wolf's face hardened at the insult, but he made no move toward Ethan. "It wasn't this band," Sarah said, praying she was right, "and they saved Rebecca Miller after Comancheros attacked her homestead and killed her husband." At this revelation, Ethan faltered slightly. The Miller attack had clearly been news to him. "Rebecca Miller is here? Alive?" Sarah nodded. "She's inside, recovering, as is the boy." Daniel Wilkins, meanwhile, had finally noticed the warriors positioned around the property and was tugging urgently at his father's sleeve. "Pa," he hissed, "there's more of 'em, lots more." Ethan paled visibly as he too became aware of their precarious situation. His hand still hovered near his pistol, though the futility of using it was obvious even to him. "If they wanted us dead, Ethan, we wouldn't be having this conversation," Sarah pointed out quietly. Stone Wolf chose that moment to speak, his deep voice startling both Wilkins men. "We do not seek war today. The healer woman has honored the old ways, life for life. My son lives because of her medicine. The Miller woman lives because we found her in time." Ethan stared at the chief, clearly struggling to reconcile this encounter with everything he believed about the Comanche. "You have a choice," Stone Wolf continued. "Ride to the fort, bring soldiers, Many will die, including you, your son, the women, or keep silent about what you see here until next sun. By then we will be gone. It was a simple calculation of survival, laid out in terms even the most prejudiced settler could understand. Ethan looked at his son, then back at Sarah, who stood her ground with quiet determination. "The Millers were good people," he said finally. "If Rebecca's alive because of this arrangement, then I won't be the one to jeopardize her recovery." He paused, clearly uncomfortable with the entire situation. "But Sarah, you're playing with fire here. These people saved a woman when they could have left her to die," Sarah interrupted firmly. "Just as I saved a boy when I could have left him to die. Sometimes, Ethan, the frontier demands we see beyond what we think we know." Ethan clearly had more objections, but a subtle shift in the positions of the hidden warriors around them served as a potent reminder of the reality they faced. "We'll keep your secret," he conceded finally, "but only until tomorrow. After that, I've got my own family to think about." Stonewolf inclined his head in acknowledgement of the agreement. "Wise choice." As the Wilkins men prepared to depart, Ethan paused, turning back to Sarah. "Thomas would be proud of your courage, Sarah, and terrified by your recklessness." A ghost of a smile crossed his weather-beaten face. "Can't say I'm much different." After they had ridden away, Sarah released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Stonewolf regarded her with newfound respect. "Not many stand between warriors and guns," he observed. "You have a strong heart." "I'm just trying to prevent more bloodshed," Sarah replied, suddenly exhausted by the encounter. Inside the cabin, Rebecca had awakened again, more lucid this time. When Sarah explained the situation, omitting the more alarming details about the full war party camped nearby, the injured woman wept silently. "James always said we should try to understand the native ways," she whispered hoarsely. "He traded fairly with some Comanche last season. They seemed not what we'd been told." Her eyes drifted to Stonewolf, who stood in the doorway. Recognition dawned in her gaze. "You were there, with the traders." When the chief nodded once in confirmation, Rebecca closed her eyes, tears still streaming down her face. "Thank you for avenging my husband." As evening approached, a remarkable scene unfolded. At the Callahan homestead, Comanche women and children, who had been kept at a safe distance until now, were permitted to approach the cabin. They brought food, strips of venison, wild onions, and a cornmeal preparation that Sarah had never encountered before. It was a peace offering of sorts, but also practical assistance for feeding the injured and their caretakers. Sarah shared her own provisions, fresh bread, preserved fruits, and the last of her coffee. The cultural exchange occurred largely through gestures and expressions, with Stonewolf occasionally translating key phrases. Tabe, strengthened by rest and his father's presence, sat on the porch with several Comanche boys his age, who listened with rapt attention to his tale of survival under the white healer woman's care. Though still weak, his status among his peers had clearly risen. He had survived an enemy attack and lived among the white settlers, experiences that would shape his understanding of the world. As darkness fell, an elderly Comanche woman approached Sarah with a small pouch of herbs. Through Stonewolf's translation, she explained these were rare medicinal plants that would help Rebecca recover her strength more quickly. The gesture, from one healer to another, transcended the barriers between their worlds. Stonewolf found Sarah later, as she stood watching the Comanche fires dotting the landscape around her property. The scene was surreal. Under any other circumstances, such fires would signal imminent danger to a lone settler. Tonight, they represented an unexpected sanctuary. "Your people will not understand what happened here," Stonewolf said, gazing at the same fires. "Neither will many of mine. Understanding often takes longer than events, Sarah replied. All I know is that two young lives, Tabe's and Rebecca's, will continue because we chose differently than expected. Stone Wolf was silent for a long moment. There is a prophecy among my people, speaks of time when great changes come to the plains, when old ways must yield to new ways for some to survive. He glanced at her. Not all change is the enemy. Not all strangers are enemies either, Sarah added quietly. The war chief nodded slowly. Dawn comes. We will leave when the sun touches the horizon. My son is strong enough to ride now. He hesitated, then continued. The Miller woman? I'll care for her, Sarah assured him. And when she's strong enough, I'll make sure she reaches. Safety! The men who attacked her, they were led by a man named Fletcher. Yellow hair, scar like snake on neck. Stone Wolf's expression darkened. We killed many, but he escaped. Dangerous man, hates all Comanche. Sarah absorbed this warning, understanding its significance. I'll be vigilant, and I'll warn others about him. Stone Wolf reached into a pouch at his waist and withdrew a small object. An intricately carved eagle, fashioned from bone, suspended on a leather cord. My son made this before his first hunt. He says to give it to you. The chief extended it toward her. Eagle sees far, protects those under its wings. The gesture caught Sarah off guard. She accepted the token carefully, recognizing the significance of such a gift. Thank him for me. Tell him I'll treasure it. He knows. Stone Wolf's gaze shifted to the eastern horizon, where the faintest lightening of the sky heralded the approaching dawn. New day comes. Things change, but some things remain. As first light began to dispel the darkness, the Comanche broke camp with practiced efficiency. Warriors mounted their horses, women gathered children, and the temporary community that had formed around Sarah's homestead prepared to vanish into the vast Texas landscape. Tabe, dressed once more in traditional Comanche attire provided by his people, approached Sarah one final time. Though they shared no common language, their connection transcended words. The boy placed his hand over his heart, then extended it toward her, a gesture so universal in its meaning that Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. She mimicked the gesture, then watched as Tabe mounted his own horse, his father steadying him. Briefly, before allowing him to ride independently toward the waiting band, Stone Wolf was the last to depart. He sat astride his horse before Sarah, the rising sun at his back casting his face in shadow. The crossing between our worlds is dangerous ground, he said. Few walk it and survive. Remember this day, Sarah Callahan. Remember that even in time of great hatred, small mercies can change what is to come. With those words, he turned his horse and rode toward his people, the powerful figure of a leader bearing the weight of an uncertain future for his band. Sarah stood on her porch, the carved eagle token warm in her palm, watching until the 60 warriors and their families disappeared over the ridge. Within moments, it was as if they had never been there at all, except for the profound change they had left behind in one settler woman's understanding of the complex tapestry that was the Texas frontier. Inside the cabin, Rebecca Miller stirred, calling weakly for water. Sarah tucked the eagle carving safely into her pocket and turned back to the everyday work of survival and healing, work that now carried new meaning after 3 extraordinary days that had begun with a simple act of mercy toward a dying boy. The weeks following the Comanche warriors' departure unfolded with a deceptive quietude that belied the profound changes brewing beneath the surface. Rebecca Miller regained her strength gradually under Sarah's attentive care, the herbal remedies provided by the Comanche healer proving remarkably effective against infection and pain. I never thought I'd owe my life to those I was taught to. Fear, Rebecca confessed one evening as they sat on the porch, watching fireflies punctuate the gathering darkness. Her delicate features, once swollen and bruised, had mostly healed, though a thin scar would permanently mark her forehead. James would say there's poetry in that. Sarah fingered the carved eagle talisman she now wore around her neck. The boundaries we draw aren't always where we think they are. For both women, the shared ordeal had forged a bond that transcended their brief acquaintance. Rebecca spoke often of her husband James, his gentle nature, his conviction that peaceful coexistence with the native tribes was possible, his dreams for their future in Texas. In her grief, these memories became a bridge to healing, a way to honor what was lost while finding strength to face what lay ahead. "What will you do now?" Sarah asked as Rebecca's recovery reached the point where decisions could no longer be postponed. The young widow's gaze drifted to the northern horizon, where the charred remains of her homestead lay. "Not return there. I couldn't." Her voice trailed off. "My sister lives in St. Louis. She's been after me to join her since our parents passed." Sarah nodded, understanding the pull of family in times of crisis. "The next supply wagon should arrive within the week. We can arrange passage for you then." Yet even as life at the Callahan homestead settled into this new rhythm, ripples from the extraordinary events spread outward through the scattered settlements of the Texas Hill Country. Ethan Wilkins had kept his promise not to immediately alert the authorities about the Comanche presence at Sarah's property. But secrets rarely remained contained on the frontier, where survival often depended on shared information. By the end of the month, versions of the story, some accurate, others wildly embellished, had reached Fort Mason and the surrounding settlements. Captain Alexander Hayes of the Texas Rangers arrived unannounced one sweltering afternoon, the dust from his horse's hooves visible long before he reached the cabin. Sarah watched his approach from the garden where she was harvesting the season's first vegetables, straightening her back and wiping soil-stained hands on her apron as he dismounted. Hayes cut an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered with a weathered face that had witnessed the worst the frontier could offer. The ranger badge on his buckskin jacket glinted in the sunlight, a symbol of authority that carried weight throughout the territory. "Miss Callahan," he greeted her, removing his hat. His tone was respectful, but guarded, his eyes taking in the homestead with the practiced assessment of a man accustomed to reading situations quickly. "Heard some interesting tales about you lately." Sarah met his gaze evenly. "People enjoy their stories, Captain, especially when the days are long and entertainment is scarce." A ghost of a smile crossed Hayes's face. "Indeed they do. Mind if we talk inside? Texas sun's unforgiving today." Rebecca was resting when they entered, but the sound of voices roused her. Hayes' eyebrows rose slightly at the sight of the recovering woman, and Sarah observed a flicker of recognition in his expression. "Mrs. Miller," he acknowledged with a nod. "Good to see you recovering. We found your husband's body. Gave him a proper burial. I'm sorry for your loss." Rebecca paled at the mention of James, but nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Captain." Hayes turned back to Sarah, his manner shifting from cordial to professional. "Now, Miss Callahan, I need a straight accounting of what happened here. Ethan Wilkins claims he encountered a full Comanche war party on your property, led by none other than Stone Wolf himself." His tone suggested skepticism, though whether toward the event or merely its scale was unclear. "Mr. Wilkins didn't exaggerate," Sarah confirmed, gesturing for Hayes to take a seat at her small kitchen table. "Stone Wolf and his warriors were here. They departed peacefully at dawn, as promised." Hayes studied her for a long moment. "You understand that harboring hostiles is a serious offense? Folks have been hanged for less." "I wasn't harboring anyone," Sarah replied steadily. "I found a wounded boy by my spring and treated his injuries. His father came looking for him. They left when the boy was strong enough to travel." "A Comanche boy," Hayes emphasized. Son of a war chief responsible for dozens of settler deaths across 3 counties. Sarah's chin lifted slightly. A child who would have died without intervention. Would you have preferred I left him to the coyotes, Captain? Hayes leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful rather than antagonistic. Most would have, considering what Comanche raids have cost this territory. I'm not most people. No, Hayes agreed after a moment. You certainly aren't. He tapped his fingers on the table, seemingly weighing his next words. There's talk in Austin about what happened here. Some are calling for your arrest as a collaborator. Others... He glanced at Rebecca. Others suggesting your actions may have opened a door that's been sealed tight for years. Rebecca straightened in her chair. Captain Hayes, I witnessed firsthand what happened here. The Comanche could have killed Sarah when they found their boy in her care. Instead, they recognized mercy when shown it. More than that, they rescued me when they had every reason to leave me to the same fate as James. Hayes listened intently, his weathered features revealing nothing of his thoughts. And this Fletcher character, the one who led the attack on your homestead, you're certain of his description? Blonde hair, snake-shaped scar on his neck? Rebecca nodded firmly. I'll never forget his face, or his voice. He seemed to take particular pleasure in... She faltered, unable to complete the thought. Hayes's jaw tightened. Jason Fletcher, former Army scout, dishonorably discharged 3 years ago for excessive brutality against Comanche prisoners. Been running with a Comanchero gang since then, using his knowledge of military movements to avoid capture. His gaze hardened. He's been playing both sides, stirring up Comanche attacks, then offering protection to settlers for extortionate prices. This revelation hung in the air, adding yet another layer of complexity to the situation. The frontier conflicts weren't simply settler versus native, but exploited by opportunists like Fletcher, who profited from perpetuating violence. Stonewolf killed most of Fletcher's gang, Sarah noted, but warned he escaped. Hayes nodded grimly. Man like that won't take such a defeat lightly. He'll want revenge against the Comanche who decimated his operation, and likely against you both for surviving to identify him. The implicit warning was clear. Sarah's extraordinary encounter with Stonewolf might have ended peacefully, but its consequences continued to unfold in dangerous ways. What happens now, Captain? Sarah asked directly. Hayes considered her question carefully. Officially, I'm here to investigate reports of unauthorized contact with hostile natives. I could arrest you. He held up a hand as Rebecca began to protest. But I won't. Whatever happened here may have prevented more bloodshed, not caused it. Relief washed over Sarah, though she maintained her composed exterior. And unofficially? Unofficially, Hayes said, lowering his voice. There are people in Austin, important people, who've been seeking a path to dialogue with the Comanche for years. Governor Runnels authorized peace talks last spring, but they collapsed before they began. Too much distrust on both sides. He leaned forward, his expression intensely focused. What happened here? A Comanche chief acknowledging a debt to a settler woman, sparing a homestead that should have been an easy target. It's unprecedented. It suggests possibilities that seemed unthinkable before. Sarah absorbed this, understanding the broader implications for the first time. Her private act of compassion toward a wounded boy had inadvertently placed her at the center of the territory's most volatile political issue. I'm not a diplomat, Captain, she said finally. I'm just a widow trying to keep my husband's dream alive. Sometimes history pivots on the actions of those who never intended to change it, Hayes replied, a hint of weariness in his tone suggesting he spoke from experience. The governor's office may contact you. If they do, I'd advise you to listen. He rose from the table, signaling the conversation's end. In the meantime, stay vigilant. Fletcher's still out there, and he's not one to forgive those who've crossed him. As Hayes prepared to depart, he paused at the door. One more thing. Miss Callahan, Stone Wolf's band has moved north, beyond the clear fork of the Brazos. The army's planning a campaign in that region come fall, if you happen to have any way of getting word to them." He left the sentence unfinished, but his meaning was clear. After the Texas Ranger had ridden away, Rebecca turned to Sarah with wide eyes. "He was asking you to warn the Comanche about military movements, a captain of the Rangers." "The world is rarely as simple as we're taught to believe," Sarah replied, echoing Stone Wolf's parting wisdom about the dangerous crossing between worlds. That evening, as twilight softened the harsh edges of the landscape, Sarah sat alone on her porch, contemplating Hayes' revelations and the unexpected role she now found herself playing. The carved eagle hung against her collarbone, a tangible reminder of connections forged through the most unlikely circumstances. A flicker of movement at the edge of her property caught her attention, too deliberate for wildlife, too cautious for a casual visitor. Sarah slipped inside and retrieved her rifle, positioning herself where she could observe without being easily seen. Minutes passed before a lone figure emerged from the lengthening shadows. A Comanche youth, perhaps 16 or 17, riding a paint horse with practiced ease. Not Taabe. This boy was older, taller, his bearing that of someone already considered a warrior among his people. He approached the cabin directly, making no attempt to conceal his presence. When he reached the yard, he dismounted and waited, apparently sensing Sarah's watchful presence. She stepped onto the porch, rifle lowered but ready. "I mean no harm," she called out in English, unsure if he would understand. To her surprise, the young warrior responded in halting but recognizable English. "Stone Wolf sends me. I am Nighthawk, his sister's son." Sarah cautiously descended the porch steps. "Is Taabe well?" Nighthawk nodded once. "He grows stronger each day, tells the story of the healing woman to all who will listen." A hint of amusement crossed his otherwise serious features. "Many stories in our camp about you, and you've come all this way to tell me this?" Sarah asked, sensing there was more to his visit. The young warrior's expression sobered. "Yellow-hair man Fletcher. He lives, gather new men, speaks of revenge against Stone Wolf's band." He paused, clearly choosing his words carefully. "Also speak your name." The warning sent a chill through Sarah despite the evening's warmth. "Captain Hayes just told me the same. Fletcher is dangerous to both our peoples." Nighthawk nodded gravely. "Stone Wolf says to tell you, watch the North Ridge at new moon. If danger comes, light 3 fires in a triangle. Our scouts will see." The offer of protection, from Comanche warriors to a settler woman, was unprecedented, a reversal of the frontier's established order that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. "Tell Stone Wolf I'm grateful," Sarah replied, "and tell him the army plans a campaign beyond the Clear Fork come fall. He should move his people further north before then." Nighthawk's eyes widened slightly, registering the significance of this information. "You warn us of your own soldiers?" "I warn people who spared me when they could have killed me," Sarah clarified. "People who saved Rebecca Miller when they could have left her to die. The debts between us flow both ways." The young warrior studied her for a long moment before nodding once in acknowledgement. "Stone Wolf was right about you. You walk between worlds without fear." "With plenty of fear," Sarah corrected him with a faint smile. "But fear doesn't always need to dictate our actions." After Nighthawk departed, melting back into the gathering darkness with the same silence with which he had appeared, Sarah returned to the cabin to find Rebecca watching from the window. "Was that—" the younger woman began. "A messenger from Stone Wolf," Sarah confirmed. "Fletcher is gathering men seeking revenge. We need to be prepared." Rebecca's face paled, but her voice remained steady. "The supply wagon should arrive in 2 days. I should be on it when it leaves." Sarah nodded, understanding the wisdom of this decision. Rebecca's recovery had progressed well enough for travel, and St. Louis offered safety that the frontier could not guarantee. "What about you?" Rebecca asked. "You could come too, start fresh somewhere safer." For a brief moment, Sarah allowed herself to envision it, leaving behind the constant vigilance, the precarious existence, the homestead that demanded everything she had just to survive. But the thought passed quickly, replaced by the certainty that had kept her here after Thomas's death. "This land is part of me now," she said simply, and recent events have only strengthened that connection. The following days passed in a flurry of preparation, gathering Rebecca's few remaining possessions, writing letters of introduction to contacts in St. Louis, assembling supplies for the journey. Throughout it all, Sarah maintained a heightened awareness of her surroundings, scanning the horizon frequently for any sign of approaching riders. The supply wagon arrived as expected, driven by Montgomery "Monty" Wilson, a grizzled veteran of the frontier, whose trading route linked the scattered settlements with San Antonio and points eastward. His eyebrows rose at the sight of Rebecca Miller, whom most had presumed dead after the attack on her homestead. "God's mercy," he muttered, helping load her trunk onto the wagon. "Fletcher's gang left no survivors at the Taylor place last spring. Thought for sure you'd met the same fate." Rebecca's composure faltered only slightly at this grim reminder of how close she had come to death. "God's mercy indeed, Mr. Wilson, and the unexpected compassion of those we're taught to fear." Monty shot a questioning glance at Sarah, who merely shook her head slightly. Some stories weren't meant for casual retelling, especially to those who traveled widely and spoke freely. As the moment of departure approached, Rebecca embraced Sarah tightly. "I'll write when I reach St. Louis," she promised, tears glistening in her eyes. "And Sarah, what happened here, what you did, it matters, more than perhaps either of us yet understands." Sarah nodded, her own eyes damp. "Safe journey, Rebecca. May you find peace there." As the wagon rumbled away, Sarah stood in her yard long after it had disappeared from view, contemplating the rapid changes that had transformed her solitary existence. The drought continued unabated, her crops struggled, and danger lurked in the form of Jason Fletcher's thirst for vengeance. Yet something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of the world and her place within it. Stonewolf's words echoed in her mind. "The crossing between our worlds is dangerous ground. Few walk it and survive." Sarah Callahan, widow, frontierswoman, reluctant bridge between colliding cultures, turned toward her cabin. The carved eagle, talisman, hung against her throat, a reminder of the unexpected connections that could form even across the deepest divides. And as the setting sun cast long shadows across the Texas hill country, she understood that while her story with the Comanche had begun with a simple act of mercy toward a dying boy, its conclusion, if there was to be one, remained unwritten. The frontier's future, like her own, balanced on the edge of possibility, where compassion might yet prove stronger than the impulse toward violence that had defined relations between settlers and natives for generations. It was dangerous ground indeed, but ground that she now recognized as worth defending, one small act of courage at a time. The new moon arrived with an oppressive stillness that seemed to hold the Texas hill country in suspense. Sarah had spent the 2 weeks since Rebecca's departure reinforcing her homestead, checking the cabin's sturdy shutters, ensuring her modest arsenal remained clean and functional, and establishing a rotation of lookout points that allowed her to monitor approaches from all directions. Sleep came in fragmented intervals, her senses perpetually alert to the smallest disturbances in the night. The warning from Nighthawk weighed heavily on her mind, not just for what it revealed about Fletcher's intentions, but for what it suggested about her altered place in the complex web of frontier relationships. She had become something unprecedented, a settler woman with a direct line of communication to a Comanche war chief. The carved eagle talisman she wore served as a constant reminder of this tenuous connection, as well as the responsibility it entailed. On the third evening of the new moon, Sarah sat on her porch, rifle across her lap, watching twilight settle over the landscape. The drought showed no signs of breaking. The creek beds remained cracked and barren, while her garden survived only through diligent rationing of the spring's precious water. Yet despite these hardships, there was a peculiar sense of purpose in her solitude now, a feeling that her continued presence on this land mattered in ways that extended beyond her personal attachment to Thomas's dream. The first sign of trouble came just after full darkness descended, the faint but unmistakable glow of torches moving along the northern ridge, at least half a mile distant but approaching with clear intent. Sarah counted 7 distinct lights, suggesting a sizable group of riders. Her heart quickened, but her movements remained deliberate, honed by years of frontier discipline. She extinguished the lamp on her porch and retreated inside, securing the door and moving to the window that offered the clearest view of the approaching threat. Minutes stretched into a half-hour as the torches wound their way down from the ridge, following the most accessible path to her homestead. Sarah used the time to position her weapons strategically throughout the cabin, the shotgun by the front door, pistol at her waist, and her husband's old cavalry saber beneath the bed as a last resort. When the riders finally entered the clearing, before her cabin, Sarah could make out their silhouettes in the moonless night, illuminated only by the dancing light of their torches. 8 men total, their faces obscured by bandanas pulled high across their features, a common tactic among outlaws who preferred their identities concealed when conducting nighttime business. One rider separated from the group, urging his mount forward until he reached the center of the yard. Even without being able to see his face clearly, there was something in his posture, an arrogant tilt to his shoulders, a calculated casualness in how he held his reins that sent a chill of recognition through Sarah. "Sarah Callahan," the man called out, his voice carrying easily in the still night air. "I know you're in there, woman. No need to hide from visitors." Sarah remained silent, observing from the darkened window. The leader pulled down his bandana, revealing features that matched Rebecca's description perfectly. The shock of blonde hair catching the torchlight, and most distinctively, the serpentine scar that slithered from beneath his jawline down the side of his neck. Jason Fletcher. "Not feeling hospitable tonight?" Fletcher called again, his tone mockingly conversational. "That's not what I heard about you. Word is you're mighty generous with your hospitality, especially to Comanche vermin." The other riders snickered, spreading out to form a loose semicircle before the cabin. Sarah noted their positioning with a soldier's eye. Thomas had taught her to assess tactical situations during their early days on the frontier. They were arranged to prevent escape, not to launch an immediate attack. Fletcher wanted something. Otherwise, they would have simply burned her out without announcing their presence. "I've got no quarrel with you, Fletcher," she finally called back, keeping herself hidden from view, "nor any welcome for men who ride after dark with covered faces." Fletcher laughed, a sound devoid of genuine mirth. "Oh, but you do have a quarrel. With me, Mrs. Callahan, you sheltered the son of the Comanche butcher who slaughtered my men. You harbored that Miller woman who could identify me to the Rangers." His voice hardened, "and most unforgivably, you warned Stone Wolf about my plans. That makes you my enemy twice over." Sarah's mind raced. How could he possibly know about her? Warning to Stone Wolf. The only explanation was that someone had betrayed her, either at Fort Mason or among the scattered settlers who might have observed Nighthawk's visit. "What do you want?" she demanded, buying time while assessing her. "Limited options," Fletcher dismounted with fluid grace, handing his torch to one of his companions. "Why, I want what any reasonable man wants when he's been wronged, Mrs. Callahan. Justice." He spat the word like a curse. "And since the law around these parts seems unwilling to punish those who collaborate with savages, I find myself obliged to administer that justice personally." He gestured casually toward the barn and outbuildings. "We'll be taking your livestock first, then your supplies. Then we'll decide whether this fine homestead would look better as a pile of ashes or as the new headquarters for my operation." His tone suggested the decision had already been made. "As for you, well, that depends entirely on how cooperative you prove to be." The implied threat hung in the air, confirming Sarah's worst fears about Fletcher's intentions. She had heard stories of what happened to women who fell into the hands of Comanche gangs. Death would be a mercy by comparison. "I count 8 of you," she called out, injecting steel into her voice. "The first who tries to enter my home dies. I'm a better shot than my husband was, and he was a cavalry marksman." Several of the men shifted uncomfortably, but Fletcher merely smiled, the expression visible even in the poor light. "Brave words, Mrs. Callahan, but we both know how this ends. You're alone out here. No one's coming to help you." As if to emphasize his point, he drew his pistol and fired a single shot into the air. The explosion shattered the night stillness, sending a flock of startled birds erupting from a nearby copse of trees. "That's for any neighbors who might be within earshot," Fletcher announced. "Let them know what happens to Comanche sympathizers. By morning, there won't be anything left here but buzzards." His men laughed again, emboldened by their leader's confidence. 2 dismounted and headed toward the barn, torches high, while another approached the chicken coop. Fletcher himself sauntered toward the cabin, drawing a second pistol from his belt. Sarah's finger tensed on her rifle's trigger. She had a clear shot at Fletcher, but taking it would immediately provoke a hail of return fire from his men. Even if she managed to kill or wound several of them, the outcome was inevitable. Fletcher knew it. She knew it. But what Fletcher didn't know, what Sarah herself could only hope, was that Stone Wolf's promise of protection hadn't been empty words. Making her decision, Sarah moved quickly to the back of the cabin, where she had prepared 3 small bundles of oil-soaked kindling. With trembling hands that nonetheless performed their task with precision, she lit the first bundle from a candle's flame and tossed it through the open window to land on a patch of bare earth she had cleared specifically for this purpose. To sharp, oil caught immediately, the flames leaping upward in the darkness. Sarah lit the second and third bundles in rapid succession, placing them in a triangular pattern, each about 10 feet from the others. Fletcher's reaction was immediate. "She's signaling!" he shouted to his men. "Shoot her! Burn it down now!" A barrage of gunfire erupted, bullets splintering the cabin's wooden walls. Sarah dropped to the floor, crawling toward the front window where her rifle still waited. Through the chaos, she heard the distinctive sound of horses in distress, frightened whinnies, and the thunder of hooves as Fletcher's men struggled to control their mounts in the face of the sudden commotion. "Get those fires out!" Fletcher was shouting, his earlier composure shattered by the unexpected development. "Reynolds, Garcia, check the ridge!" Sarah reached her rifle and risked a glance outside. Fletcher's carefully orchestrated attack had dissolved into confusion, his men dividing their attention between the fires, their nervous horses, and the now ominous darkness surrounding them. What happened next occurred with such swift precision that later, when Sarah attempted to describe it to Captain Hayes, she found words inadequate to capture the lethal choreography she witnessed. The first indication was a single arrow that seemed to materialize from nowhere, burying itself in the chest of one of Fletcher's men as he attempted to douse one of Sarah's signal fires. He crumpled without a sound, the torch he had been holding rolling harmlessly onto the damp earth Sarah had prepared around the fire pit. Then came the war cries. high, ululating sounds that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, playing havoc with Fletcher's men's ability to locate their attackers. Shadows detached themselves from the surrounding darkness, moving with the fluid grace of predators who had mastered the art of night fighting across generations. Comanche warriors, at least a dozen from what Sarah could discern, had surrounded the homestead with such silent efficiency that neither she nor Fletcher's gang had detected their approach. Now they struck with the ruthless effectiveness that had made them the most feared fighting force on the southern plains. "It's an ambush!" one of Fletcher's men screamed, firing blindly into the darkness before an arrow found his throat, cutting off his warning in a wet gurgle. Fletcher himself displayed the quick thinking that had allowed him to survive on the frontier's most treacherous margins. Instead of mounting a defense, he immediately bolted for his horse, firing behind him as he ran. Two of his remaining men attempted to follow his example, while the others formed a desperate circle, their backs to each other as arrows rained down with deadly accuracy. Sarah watched in stunned silence as the brief, brutal confrontation played out in her yard. Within minutes, 5 of Fletcher's 8 men lay motionless on the ground. One of the fleeing riders had made it as far as the edge of the clearing before a mounted Comanche warrior overtook him, the swing of a war club ending his escape with chilling finality. Fletcher himself had nearly reached the northern slope, his superior horsemanship evident even in retreat when 3 mounted warriors converged on his position. Sarah lost sight of him in the darkness, but the sounds of struggle carried clearly through the night air. Moments later, all fell silent. The signal fires continued to burn, casting flickering light over a scene transformed from imminent tragedy to something else entirely. A frontier justice as swift and merciless as the land itself. A lone figure approached the cabin, recognizable, even in the uncertain light, Nighthawk, Stonewolf's nephew and messenger. "Healing woman!" he called out. "You are safe now!" Sarah cautiously opened her door, rifle still ready. "Fletcher?" she asked, her voice hoarse with tension. "Alive," Nighthawk replied, his expression suggesting this status was temporary. "Stone. Wolf wants him for himself." As if summoned by his name, the Comanche warchief emerged from the darkness, flanked by warriors leading a bound and bloodied Jason Fletcher. Stonewolf's face was painted for war, black stripes across his cheekbones, making his features seem hewn from shadow itself. He wore a full headdress of eagle feathers that accentuated his already imposing height. "Sarah Callahan," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "We will meet again." Despite everything she had just witnessed, Sarah felt an unexpected sense of relief at his presence. "You came," she said simply. "We promised," Stonewolf replied, as if this explained everything. In many ways it did. For the Comanche, as she had come to understand, honor and obligation were not abstract concepts but the fundamental currency of survival. Fletcher, forced to his knees before Sarah's porch, glared up at her with undisguised hatred. "Comanche whore!" he spat, blood from a cut above his eye mixing with the saliva. "Should have burned you out the moment we arrived." Stonewolf struck him across the face with casual force, sending the captive sprawling in the dirt. "You speak to her with respect," he commanded. "She is under my protection." The declaration hung in the air, its significance transcending the immediate confrontation. A Comanche chief, publicly claiming a settler woman under his protection, violated every established boundary of frontier relations. Sarah descended her porch steps, approaching Stonewolf with the dignity of someone navigating a formal diplomatic exchange rather than the aftermath of violence. "Thank you for honoring your word," she said, loud enough for all present to hear. Stonewolf inclined his head. "The eagle watches over you, as my son said it would." His gaze shifted to the talisman visible at her throat. "You wear his gift." Every day, Sarah confirmed. It reminds me that mercy can come from unexpected sources. Fletcher, recovering from the blow, laughed bitterly from his position on the ground. Mercy? Is that what you call this unholy alliance? The settlers will hang you when they learn of it, if the army doesn't shoot you first. Stonewolf regarded the captive with the dispassionate assessment of someone evaluating an animal for slaughter. This man has raided both Comanche camps and settler homesteads. He profits from death. His own should benefit both our peoples. The implication was clear. Fletcher's execution would serve as both justice and a symbolic joining of interests between Stonewolf's band and Sarah, as representatives of those settlers who sought coexistence rather than conquest. Yet something in Sarah recoiled at the thought, not from squeamishness about Fletcher's fate, which he had undoubtedly earned, but from awareness of its potential consequences. Captain Hayes had spoken of influential people in Austin seeking a path to dialogue with the Comanche. Fletcher's death at Stonewolf's hands, however justified, would further inflame tensions at a critical moment. His crimes deserve death, Sarah agreed carefully. But there's another way. She met Stonewolf's questioning gaze. The Texas Rangers have been hunting him for months. If you deliver him to Captain Hayes at Fort Mason, it would show that Comanche justice and settler law can find common ground. Wolf considered this, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. The warriors around him watched silently, awaiting his decision. Hayes is a fair man, Sarah continued. Fletcher would hang legally, with witnesses to his crimes testifying against him, including Rebecca Miller, who survived his attack. Fletcher's face contorted with fury. You'll both die for this betrayal. Your men are dead. Night. Hawk interrupted coldly. No one will come seeking vengeance for you. Stonewolf raised a hand, silencing further discussion. The woman speaks with wisdom. He turned to Sarah. You suggest we trust Ranger Hayes with this justice? Sarah nodded. I believe he'll honor the opportunity this presents, not just to punish Fletcher, but to demonstrate that cooperation between our peoples is possible. For a long moment, Stonewolf stood motionless, weighing alternatives that would have profound implications far beyond this isolated homestead. Finally, he turned to Nighthawk and issued a series of commands in their native tongue. We will take him to the fort at first light, Stonewolf informed Sarah. 4 warriors only, myself, Nighthawk, and 2 others. The rest will return to our camp. Fletcher cursed viciously until one of the warriors gagged him with a strip of cloth torn from his own shirt. He must be alive when we deliver him, Stonewolf clarified, a hint of regret in his tone, but he need not be comfortable. As the Comanche warriors secured their prisoner and cleared the evidence of the brief but deadly skirmish, Sarah found herself standing alone with Stonewolf at the edge of her property. The signal fires had burned down to embers, their purpose fulfilled beyond anything she could have imagined when Nighthawk first explained their significance. Your son? She asked. Taabe? He continues to recover well? Something that might have been a smile flickered across Stonewolf's stern features. He insists on joining hunting parties already. His mother would have called him stubborn, like someone else I have met. He glanced meaningfully at Sarah. Survival on the frontier requires a certain stubbornness, she acknowledged. Yes, but survival alone is not enough. Stonewolf gazed toward the eastern horizon, where the faintest lightning heralded the eventual dawn. Our people fight because each sees only one path forward. You saw another path when you helped my son. Sarah considered his words carefully. One act of mercy doesn't erase generations of conflict. No, Stonewolf agreed, but many small mercies. Over time, perhaps. He removed a small leather pouch from his belt. Taabe asked that I bring you this. Healing herbs. He says your supply must be low after helping him and the Miller woman. The thoughtful gift from the boy whose life she had saved brought unexpected tears to Sarah's eyes. "Thank him for me. Tell him I think of him often." Stonewolf handed her the pouch. "Perhaps one day you will tell him yourself, if the path we begin tonight leads where it might." As the first birds began their tentative calls to the approaching dawn, Sarah Callahan watched Stonewolf return. To his warriors, the night's events had irrevocably altered her place on the frontier. Whether that place would lead to bridge building or to her own destruction remained to be seen. But as she clutched the pouch of healing herbs, a gift from a Comanche boy to a settler woman, Sarah felt something she had not experienced since Thomas's death. Hope that the endless cycle of violence might someday yield to something wiser, something worthy of the land they all claimed to love. Dawn broke over the Texas hill country, illuminating a scene that history would never record, but whose consequences would ripple outward in ways no one present could fully imagine. A new day had begun, not just for Sarah Callahan and Stonewolf, but perhaps for the frontier itself. The journey to Fort Mason began at first light, an unlikely procession making its way across the drought-stricken landscape. Stonewolf and 3 warriors, Nighthawk among them, rode with the calculated vigilance of men venturing deep into hostile territory. Between them, bound securely to his mount, Jason Fletcher swayed in sullen silence, the gag removed, but his murderous glares serving as adequate replacement for his earlier vitriol. Sarah rode alongside Stonewolf, her presence both practical, guide and symbolic bridge between worlds. She had changed from her nightclothes into a simple riding dress, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical braid, the carved eagle talisman visible at her throat, a deliberate choice that would not go unnoticed by those they would soon encounter. "The fort commander is Major Lawrence Harrington," Sarah explained as they rode, "a career soldier, but not a man blinded by prejudice. He served with my husband Thomas during the Mexican War." Stonewolf absorbed this information with a slight nod. "And this Hayes, the ranger captain, reports to Austin, not to the fort," Sarah clarified, "but he maintains good relations with Harrington. If they're both present when we arrive, it strengthens our position." The war chief studied her with newfound appreciation. "You speak of positions and strengths, like a council leader planning for negotiation." Sarah hadn't thought of it in those terms, but recognized the accuracy of his observation. "My father was a lawyer in Pennsylvania. I grew up listening to him discuss strategy for his cases." A faint smile crossed her face at the memory. "He would be astonished to see how I'm applying those lessons now." As they crested a rise that offered a clear view of the surrounding territory, Stonewolf raised his hand, signaling the party to halt. His keen eyes scanned the horizon with the practiced assessment of a hunter accustomed to distinguishing potential threats from benign elements in the landscape. "Riders," he announced, pointing southeast. 5, moving fast." Sarah followed his gesture, squinting against the morning glare. At first, she could discern nothing, but gradually the distant figures came into focus. Mounted men approaching at a gallop, their course intersecting directly with the path to Fort Mason. "Rangers," she concluded after studying their riding formation. "Captain Hayes must have had patrols out looking for Fletcher." Stonewolf exchanged glances with his warriors, tension evident in their postures. This unexpected encounter, away from the relative safety of the fort's structured environment, introduced a dangerous element of unpredictability to their plan. "We could avoid them," Nighthawk suggested, gesturing toward a ravine to their west. "That would provide cover." "Deliver the prisoner directly to the fort." Stonewolf considered this briefly before shaking his head. "No, such action would suggest guilt or fear." He turned to Sarah. "We will meet them openly, but you must speak first. They will see your face before they see our war paint." The wisdom of this approach was evident. Sarah urged her horse forward, positioning herself at the front of their small party as the rangers drew nearer. She removed her bonnet, allowing the morning sun to illuminate her features clearly, a white woman's face that might give the approaching riders a momentary pause before they registered the Comanche warriors behind her. As the distance between them closed rapidly, Sarah recognized Captain Hayes leading the patrol. She raised her hand in greeting, a deliberate gesture of peaceful intent that she hoped would diffuse the rangers' instinctive reaction to finding Comanche warriors so far into settled territory. Hayes's patrol slowed abruptly, rifles rising to ready positions before the captain himself signaled his men to hold their fire. His expression, as he recognized Sarah, shifted from alertness to astonishment, especially as he registered her companions. "Miss Callahan," he called, maintaining a cautious distance. "This is an unexpected meeting." His gaze moved past her to Stonewolf, recognition dawning in his weathered features, and even more unexpected company. "Captain Hayes," Sarah acknowledged with formal courtesy. "We were hoping to find you at the fort. It seems fortune has saved us the journey." Hayes's eyes narrowed slightly. "And what business brings you and a Comanche war party onto the main road in broad daylight? A situation that might easily be misinterpreted by less patient men than myself." Sarah gestured toward their bound prisoner. "We bring Jason Fletcher, wanted for the murder of James Miller and numerous other citizens. He attacked my homestead last night with 7 men, intending to add me to his list of victims." At the mention of Fletcher's name, Hayes's attention sharpened considerably. He signaled to his men to lower their weapons further, though they remained visibly tense, hands never straying far from triggers. "Fletcher," he repeated, studying the bound man with undisguised satisfaction. "We've been hunting him for months." His gaze returned to Stonewolf, though I admit I didn't expect him to be delivered by a Comanche war chief. Stonewolf met the ranger's assessing look without flinching. "Fletcher is an enemy to both our peoples. He raids Comanche camps, steals our horses, kills our hunters, then does the same to white settlers, profits from keeping war between us." Hayes absorbed this statement, its diplomatic implications clearly not lost on him. After a moment's consideration, he dismounted and approached Fletcher, examining the prisoner's bindings and condition with professional detachment. "Seems you've had a rough night, Fletcher," he observed dryly, "though considerably better than you deserve." Fletcher spat in response, his venomous glare encompassing both Hayes and his captors. "These savages ambushed my men, slaughtered them, and that woman," he jerked his head toward Sarah, "she's a traitor to her own kind, signaled them to attack us." "After you threatened to burn me out and worse," Sarah countered evenly. "Captain Hayes, Fletcher arrived at my homestead with 7 armed men, openly declaring his intention to punish me for helping Tarb, Stonewolf's injured son, and for sheltering Rebecca Miller after Fletcher's gang murdered her husband." Hayes considered this information thoughtfully. "Mrs. Miller is alive, then?" "We found what remained of her husband at their homestead, assumed she'd met the same fate or worse." "She's safely on her way to St. Louis," Sarah confirmed, "and prepared to testify against Fletcher should the need arise." The ranger captain turned, his attention back to Stonewolf. "And you just happened to be in the vicinity when Fletcher attacked Miss Callahan's property." "We kept watch," Stonewolf replied unapologetically. "Since the boy was returned to us, we have scouts near her land. She is under our protection." The statement, spoken plainly before rangers and fellow warriors alike, hung in the air with profound significance. A Comanche chief publicly declaring a white settler under tribal protection violated every established boundary of frontier relations. Hayes's eyebrows rose slightly, but he offered no immediate comment on this extraordinary arrangement. Instead, he gestured for 2 of his men to take custody of Fletcher. "We'll take him from here," he said, his tone professional but not hostile. "He'll stand trial in Austin for his crimes against Texas citizens. I give you my word on that." Stonewolf nodded once in acknowledgement. "And his crimes against my people?" A flicker of discomfort crossed Hayes's face. The complex question of overlapping jurisdictions and justice systems that had no established precedent for resolution. "Those will be noted in the proceedings, as will your cooperation in his capture." It wasn't a completely satisfactory answer, but it represented a step toward recognition that crimes against the Comanche deserved acknowledgement within the Texas legal system, however limited that acknowledgement might be. "There is something else we must discuss," Stonewolf continued, his voice pitched low enough that only Hayes, Sarah, and Nighthawk could hear him clearly. "Army movements beyond Clear Fork. Large campaign planned for fall." Hayes's expression remained carefully neutral, though Sarah noted a slight tensing around his eyes. "That's military business, Chief. Outside my jurisdiction. It becomes ranger business when unnecessary blood is spilled," Stonewolf countered. "Fletcher is not only one who profits from conflict between our peoples. The implicit accusation that certain elements within both military and civilian leadership benefited from perpetuating hostilities was dangerous territory indeed. Yet Hayes did not immediately dismiss it, suggesting he harbored similar suspicions. "What are you proposing?" he asked cautiously. Stonewolf gestured toward Sarah. "The healing woman saved my son when others would have left him to die. When I came with warriors at dawn, I could have burned her homestead as revenge for many Comanche deaths. Instead, I saw wisdom in mercy." His gaze intensified. "There are others among my people who would listen to talk of peace. Are there such men among yours?" Hayes glanced at his rangers, ensuring they remained at a distance before responding. "The governor has authorized exploratory discussions," he admitted. "But after previous failures, he needs assurances that any Comanche representatives truly speak for their people." "I speak for the largest band south of Red River," Stonewolf stated without boast. "Others will follow, if path proves." "True." Sarah observed this exchange with growing appreciation for Stonewolf's strategic vision. What had begun as a simple act of mercy toward a wounded boy had evolved, through the war chief's calculated responses, into a potential opening for genuine diplomatic engagement, something that had eluded both sides for generations. Hayes seemed to reach a decision. "I'll send word to Austin. If the governor agrees, representatives could meet at neutral ground in 30 days' time." He glanced at Sarah. "Perhaps Miss Callahan's homestead would serve. It appears to have unique standing with both parties." The suggestion startled Sarah, though she quickly recognized its practical and symbolic value. Her property, situated on the edge of settled territory, offered both accessibility and a precedent for peaceful interaction between settlers and Comanche. "I would be honored to host such a meeting," she said firmly. Stonewolf nodded his agreement. 30 days. Small. Party only. 3 chiefs, 3 white leaders. More brings too many spirits of the dead between us. With the outline of this unprecedented arrangement tentatively established, the groups prepared to separate, Fletcher secured among the rangers, while Stonewolf and his warriors would return to their territory with news of both the prisoners' fate and the proposed peace talks. As final arrangements were made, Hayes drew Sarah aside, his expression troubled. "You understand what you're becoming involved in?" he asked quietly. "If these talks proceed at your homestead, there are those on both sides who would consider you a traitor for facilitating them." Sarah met his concerned gaze steadily. "I buried my husband on that land, Captain. Watched neighbors and friends die in raids and counter-raids that solved nothing. If there's even a small chance to break that cycle, isn't it worth the risk?" Hayes studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Thomas always said you had more courage than sense." A reluctant smile crossed his weathered features. Seems he was right on both counts. As the ranger patrol departed with their prisoner, Sarah found herself once again alone with Stone Wolf and his warriors at the crossroads between their worlds. The morning sun had risen fully now, casting harsh light across a landscape shaped by conflict, yet somehow, in this moment, offering a glimpse of alternative possibilities. "You will be watched more closely now," Stone Wolf warned as they prepared. "To part ways, by both my people and yours. Some will not understand what you do." "Understanding often comes after actions, not before," Sarah replied, echoing wisdom he had shared in their previous encounter. "I can only follow the path that seems right." Stone Wolf reached into a pouch at his waist and withdrew a small object, a second carved eagle, twin to the one Sarah already wore, but fashioned from pale bone rather than dark wood. "When our representatives come for the council, they will carry this token. It will show they come with true hearts." Sarah accepted the carving, recognizing its significance as both practical verification and symbolic trust. "I'll watch for them at the appointed time." As she turned her horse toward home, Nighthawk unexpectedly moved his mount alongside hers. "The boy Taabe asked me to tell you something," he said, his English careful but clear. "He says when he becomes a man, he will remember the woman who fought the fever spirit for him. He will tell his children that not all whites carry hatred in their hearts." The simple message, delivered across cultural boundaries that had seemed impenetrable mere weeks earlier, affected Sarah more deeply than she could express. "Tell him I will do the same," she replied softly. "Tell him that because of his courage, other children, both Comanche and settler, may grow up knowing less fear and more understanding." The return journey to her homestead passed in contemplative silence, the landscape familiar yet somehow transformed by recent events. The bodies of Fletcher's men had been removed by Stone Wolf's warriors, leaving little evidence of the previous night's violence. Yet Sarah knew her property had been irrevocably changed. No longer simply the isolated homestead of a stubborn widow, but potentially a landmark in the territory's turbulent history. As she approached her cabin, Sarah was surprised to see a wagon parked outside. Ethan Wilkins and his teenage son Daniel unloading lumber and tools in her yard. They paused at her arrival, Ethan's expression a complex mixture of concern and determination. "Heard shots last night," he explained without preamble. "Figured you might need some repairs, and Emily insisted on sending food." He gestured toward several baskets visible in the wagon. "Though I see you've had other visitors." His gaze shifted meaningfully to the distant ridge, where a lone Comanche scout was just visible, keeping watch as Sarah returned safely home. Sarah dismounted, suddenly aware of how exhausted she felt after the night's events and the mornings. "Diplomatic negotiations. It's a long story, Ethan." "Always is with you, Sarah," he replied with grudging affection. "Daniel, get those supplies inside while I help Miss Callahan with her horse." As they walked the animal toward the barn, Ethan lowered his voice. "Word spreading about you and the Comanche chief. Hayes's rangers stopped by our place early this morning looking for Fletcher. They were talkative." Sarah had expected this, though perhaps not quite so quickly. "And what are people saying?" Ethan sighed, removing his hat to wipe his brow. "Some are calling you a traitor. Others saying you've lost your mind from grief and loneliness." He paused. "A few, though, the ones who've buried too many loved ones in this war. They're asking different questions, wondering if there might be another way forward." He gestured toward his son, working diligently to repair a section of porch railing damaged during Fletcher's attack. "Daniel there. He's of age to join the Rangers next spring. Emily wakes crying from nightmares about it 3 times a week." Ethan's weathered face revealed a father's vulnerability rarely displayed on the stoic frontier. "If what you're doing leads to even a chance of something better, well, We've got your back, Sarah. Not everyone will, but we do. The unexpected support brought tears to Sarah's eyes. There's to be a council here in 30 days. Ethan absorbed this with remarkable composure, given its unprecedented nature. Then we'd best get this place looking proper. He managed a wry smile. Can't have the governor's representatives thinking frontier women don't keep a tidy homestead, even when negotiating with Comanche chiefs. As weeks passed, Sarah's homestead transformed in subtle but significant ways. The physical repairs were the most obvious. Damage from Fletcher's attack meticulously mended, the barns strengthened, new shutters crafted for windows that could be secured quickly if needed. Ethan and Daniel Wilkins returned regularly to assist, sometimes accompanied by other neighboring settlers who had decided, after careful consideration, to support Sarah's unconventional position. Less visible, but more profound, were the changes in the human landscape surrounding the property. Comanche scouts maintained a discreet presence on the distant ridges, while rangers patrolled with increased frequency along the main road, both forces ostensibly monitoring the other, yet simultaneously ensuring that the site of the proposed peace talks remained secure from potential sabotage by those who preferred continued conflict. Letters arrived from Austin, formal correspondence from the governor's office confirming the planned council and outlining protocols to be observed. Captain Hayes visited twice, bringing supplies and information about the delegates who would represent Texas interests. The governor's trusted advisor, Judge William Brennan, Frontier Battalion Commander Major Samuel Porter, and Hayes himself. As liaison to the Rangers, from Rebecca Miller came a letter posted from St. Louis, expressing both gratitude for her rescue and encouragement for Sarah's efforts toward reconciliation. James would have said, "You're doing God's work," she wrote, though he might have questioned his methods. The letter concluded with news that Rebecca had begun assisting at a mission school that educated children of various backgrounds, finding purpose in continuing her husband's belief in understanding across cultural divides. As the appointed day approached, Sarah found herself standing on her porch in the golden light of sunset, watching as a column of dust on the horizon signaled the arrival of the Texas delegation. They would stay the night, with the Comanche representatives expected at dawn, a scheduling that reflected Stonewolf's original appearance at her homestead after Taabe's recovery. She touched the carved eagle at her throat, its twin safely stored. Inside, to be compared with the token the Comanche delegates would bring. So much had changed since she had discovered a wounded boy beside her spring, changes that rippled outward from that simple act of mercy to potentially alter the course of an entire territory's future. Yet as Sarah Callahan prepared to welcome the first participants in what would become known in regional histories as the Eagle Token Council, she harbored no illusions about the challenges ahead. Generations of bloodshed and mistrust could not be erased in a single meeting, no matter how historic. Stonewolf's people faced existential threats to their way of life, while the settlers' determination to claim the land for themselves showed no signs of abating. What she had created, what that wounded Comanche boy had made possible through his need and her response, was merely an opening. A brief pause in the cycle of violence that might, with tremendous effort and goodwill on both sides, eventually widen into something more sustainable. As Judge Brennan's carriage drew to a stop in her yard, Sarah straightened her shoulders and stepped forward to greet the man whose pen would record whatever agreements might emerge from the unprecedented gathering. Behind her stood the cabin where she had tended Taabe's wounds. Before her stretched the clearing where Stonewolf had appeared at dawn with 60 warriors, and surrounding it all, the contested land that both peoples claimed as their own. The Texas frontier had been forged in blood and claimed through conquest. But perhaps, just perhaps, its future might be shaped by something more hopeful. The recognition that mercy, offered at great risk across seemingly insurmountable divides, could reveal pathways previously hidden to both sides. Sarah Callahan, once simply a widow struggling to maintain her husband's dream, had become something she never anticipated, a bridge between worlds that had known only enmity. Whatever happened next would be written not just in the official records Judge Brennan would create, but in the stories told around Comanche fires and settler hearths for generations to come. The story of a woman who saved a dying Comanche boy, and how 3 days later, when his father came with 60 warriors at dawn, the frontier itself began, ever so slightly, to change. Dawn broke over the Callahan homestead in a spectacular array of crimson and gold, as if the Texas sky itself recognized the historic significance of the day. Sarah had been awake for hours, making final preparations while the Texas delegation, Judge William Brennan, Major Samuel Porter, and Captain Hayes, gathered on her porch, their expressions revealing varying degrees of anticipation and apprehension. "They'll come from the north," Sarah explained, offering the men coffee as they watched the horizon. "Stonewolf is punctual to a fault." Judge Brennan, a dignified man in his 60s with silver hair and penetrating blue eyes, sipped his coffee, thoughtfully. "In all my years on the bench, I never imagined I'd be participating in negotiations with Comanche chiefs on a widow's porch." He glanced at Sarah with respectful curiosity. "You've accomplished what diplomatic envoys and military commanders have failed to achieve for decades, Mrs. Callahan." "I saved a boy's life," Sarah replied simply. "The rest was Stonewolf's doing." Major Porter snorted softly, his military bearing evident even in casual conversation. "With all due respect, ma'am, you've done considerably more than that. Reports indicate you've been acting as an unofficial intermediary between Stonewolf's band and local settlers for weeks now." Sarah met his skeptical gaze steadily. "Information that prevents bloodshed benefits everyone, Major. I merely passed along what each side needed to know to avoid unnecessary conflict." Hayes, more familiar with Sarah's situation than the others, intervened before Porter could pursue his line of questioning. "They're coming," he announced, gesturing toward the northern ridge where mounted figures had appeared, silhouetted against the brightening sky. The approach of the Comanche delegation was deliberately measured. Neither the thundering charge that had marked their first arrival at Sarah's homestead, nor the cautious stealth of warriors anticipating hostility. 3 riders led the procession, with a small escort of 6 warriors following at a respectful distance. Stonewolf in the center, Hayes identified, his experienced eye recognizing the war chief even at a distance. The one on his right appears to be Red Knife, chief of the Penatica band. The third is likely Black Elk of the Noconi. Together they represent the majority of Comanche forces in this region. Judge Brennan straightened his formal coat, the document case at his side containing the governor's authorization and preliminary proposals. "Remember, gentlemen, we are here to listen as much as to speak." The governor was explicit. "This meeting is exploratory, not definitive. We seek common ground, not immediate concessions." As the Comanche leaders drew nearer, Sarah noted the absence of war paint on their faces, a deliberate choice signifying they came for counsel, not combat. Stonewolf wore a ceremonial headdress, though more modest than the full war bonnet he had displayed during Fletcher's capture. Around his neck hung a single bear claw on a leather cord, a symbol of authority among his people. Sarah descended the porch steps to meet them, conscious of her role as both hostess and intermediary. The carved eagle talisman was prominently displayed at her throat, matched by its twin that Stonewolf now produced from a pouch at his waist as his horse halted before her. "Sarah Callahan," he greeted her formally, his deep voice carrying to all present, "we come as promised." "You are welcome here," she responded with equal formality, Accepting the bone eagle he extended and comparing it with her own carving, the matched set confirming the authenticity of the delegates to both sides. These men represent the government of Texas, authorized to speak with open hearts. The ritual completed, Stonewolf and his fellow chiefs dismounted with dignified grace. Up close, the differences between the three Comanche leaders became more apparent. Red Knife was older, perhaps in his 60s, his face deeply lined and bearing that of someone who had witnessed the earliest encroachments on Comanche territory. Black Elk was younger than Stonewolf by perhaps a decade, his expression guarded but intelligent, assessing the Texas representatives with keen interest. Judge Brennan stepped forward, offering a formal bow rather than extending his hand, a cultural consideration that Sarah had advised. "I am William Brennan, appointed by Governor Runnels to hear your words and share the thoughts of Texas leadership. We honor your willingness to meet." Stonewolf acknowledged the introduction with a slight nod. "Many winters I have fought the Texans. Many Comanche have died, many white settlers also. Time to see if another path exists before too few remain on either side to walk it." The stark pragmatism of this opening statement set the tone for what followed. Rather than proceeding immediately to specific grievances or demands, Stonewolf suggested they begin with a shared meal, a Comanche custom that temporarily suspended hostilities and created space for genuine conversation. Sarah had prepared for this, setting a long table under the spreading oak tree that shaded her yard. Simple but abundant food was laid out. Venison provided by the Comanche, bread and vegetables from Sarah's garden, coffee and preserved fruits contributed by neighboring settlers who supported the peace initiative. As they gathered around the table, an extraordinary scene unfolded. Texas officials and Comanche chiefs breaking bread together on contested ground, with a frontier widow serving as both hostess and translator when cultural nuances required clarification. Comanche escorts and rangers maintained a watchful perimeter, their mutual suspicion evident but temporarily subordinated to the greater purpose. The meal provided an opportunity for each side to assess the other outside the rigid constraints of formal negotiation. Judge Brennan discussed his decades of experience with Texas law, while Red Knife spoke of Comanche traditions that had governed their people for generations before white settlement. Porter's initial stiffness gradually relaxed as he discovered that Black Elk shared his interest in horsemanship, leading to a spirited exchange about breeding practices and training methods. Throughout this preliminary interaction, Sarah observed the subtle currents of power and personality, recognizing how fragile this moment truly was. One misinterpreted gesture, one careless word could shatter the tentative civility and return them all to the safer, more familiar territory of mutual hostility. When the meal concluded, Stonewolf suggested they move to the shaded porch for the formal council. The seating arrangement evolved naturally. The three Comanche chiefs on one side, the Texas representatives on the other, with Sarah positioned at the junction between them, physically embodying her role as bridge between worlds. Judge Brennan opened the proceedings by outlining the governor's position. Texas recognized the Comanche as powerful adversaries whose cooperation was preferable to continued conflict. The territory's rapid settlement made previous patterns of seasonal migration increasingly untenable for both sides. Some accommodation must be found that allowed for both Comanche survival and Texas development. The governor proposes designated territories, Brennan explained, unfolding a map across the small table. Land north of the Red River would remain Comanche hunting grounds, protected from settlement. In exchange, your people would cease raids on settlements south of this boundary. Red Knife, who had remained largely silent during the meal, leaned forward to study the map with evident skepticism. "We have heard such promises before," he said, his English more heavily accented than Stonewolf's, but still comprehensible. Lines drawn on paper that white men forget when gold is found or more settlers come. This would be formalized in a treaty, Brennan clarified. Enforceable by Rangers and the U.S. Army. The same Rangers and Army that have burned our villages? Black Elk asked pointedly. The same who give bounties for Comanche scalps. Major Porter shifted uncomfortably at this direct reference to practices he had privately opposed but publicly defended as military necessity. The situation has changed, he offered. The governor recognizes that constant warfare serves neither side. The territory needs stability to prosper. Stonewolf had been studying the map with careful attention, his finger tracing the proposed boundary. This line cuts through traditional Pennateca hunting grounds, he observed, and separates Noconi from sacred sites where ancestors' spirits dwell. The Texas representatives exchanged glances, clearly unprepared for such specific geographical knowledge. Sarah had anticipated this obstacle, however. Perhaps the boundary could be adjusted, she suggested, addressing both sides. If specific areas hold particular significance, might they be included in the protected territory, even if they fall south of the Red River? Judge Brennan hesitated before responding. The governor authorized some flexibility in the exact delineation. We would need to understand precisely which areas you consider essential. What followed was a remarkable exchange as Stonewolf and his fellow chiefs identified locations of cultural and practical significance to their people, while the Texas representatives noted each one and assessed its impact on settlement plans. Areas that had appeared as anonymous wilderness on their maps emerged as rich with meaning. Ancestral burial grounds, traditional gathering places for medicine plants, hunting territories vital to seasonal sustenance. By midday, the initial map had been marked with dozens of annotations, creating a much more complex picture of the landscape than the simple north-south division originally proposed. Major Porter, despite his initial skepticism, proved unexpectedly valuable in this process, his military cartography experience allowing him to translate Comanche descriptions into precise geographical notations. This is merely the beginning, Judge Brennan cautioned as they paused for refreshment. Any adjustments must be approved in Austin and ultimately in Washington, but you have helped us understand your needs with greater clarity. Stonewolf nodded, his expression revealing neither optimism nor disappointment, merely the measured assessment of a leader accustomed to lengthy negotiations. There is another matter we must discuss, he said, the problem of those who profit from war between us. Hayes leaned forward, immediately attentive. You're speaking of men like Fletcher, and others like him on both sides, Stonewolf confirmed. Comancheros who sell weapons, then spread lies about attacks, military contractors who need conflict to sell supplies, even some of your settlers who claim Comanche raid damage to collect government payment when their crops fail from drought. This frank acknowledgement of corruption within both societies created a momentary tension, but Judge Brennan nodded slowly. The governor is aware that certain parties actively undermine peace efforts. It would benefit both sides to identify and neutralize such influences. We propose joint patrols, Stonewolf said, introducing a concept so unprecedented that even Sarah was taken aback. Comanche warriors and Texas Rangers riding together along the agreed boundaries, each watching the other, yes, but also witnessing together when troublemakers try to break peace. Major Porter's immediate reaction was predictably negative. Armed Comanche operating alongside Rangers. Impossible. The settlers would never accept it. They already have, Hayes interjected quietly, in a limited fashion. When Porter turned to him in surprise, the Ranger captain elaborated. The capture of Fletcher was essentially a joint operation between Rangers and Stonewolf's warriors. It proved effective. One isolated incident is hardly precedent for formal policy, Porter objected, but it demonstrates possibility, Judge Brennan mused, stroking his silver beard thoughtfully. Perhaps not immediate implementation, but as an aspirational goal, something to work toward as trust builds. The discussion continued through the afternoon, ranging from practical concerns about implementation to broader philosophical questions about how two such different societies could coexist. Throughout, Sarah observed a gradual but significant shift in the interaction, from formal diplomatic posturing to increasingly genuine problem-solving, with both sides acknowledging obstacles while seeking workable solutions. As daylight began to wane, Judge Brennan suggested they formalize what they had accomplished thus far. I propose we draft a preliminary understanding, not a binding treaty, but a framework for continued dialogue. It would acknowledge the territorial considerations we've discussed and establish a schedule for further meetings. Stonewolf consulted briefly with Red Knife and Black Elk before responding. This is acceptable, but it must include recognition of the Eagle Token Council itself, this new way of speaking between us. And it must name Stonewolf and his band under protection of Sarah Callahan, and her under protection of Stonewolf, as happened with Fletcher. The request directly addressed what everyone present had privately acknowledged, that Sarah's unique position as someone trusted by both sides was integral to the process. Formalizing that role would both protect her from accusations of treason by settlers and validate her status as someone the Comanche could trust with their concerns. I believe the governor would approve such a provision, Judge Brennan said after consideration. Captain Hayes? It merely codifies what already exists in practice, Hayes agreed, and provides a channel for communication that benefits both sides. As Brennan began drafting the document, Sarah excused herself briefly to prepare lanterns against the approaching darkness. Standing alone in her kitchen, she was struck by the surreal transformation of her homestead, from isolated widow's refuge to the site of potentially historic dialogue between enemies who had known only bloodshed for generations. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted her thoughts. Stonewolf appeared in the doorway, his imposing figure somehow not out of place in her modest cabin. "Your words have been good today," he said without preamble. "You speak with understanding of both sides." "I've had unusual teachers," Sarah replied, thinking of Taab's quiet courage during his recovery and Rebecca Miller's remarkable resilience in the face of tragedy. "How is your son?" A rare smile softened Stonewolf's stern features. "He demands to attend the next council. Says the healing woman will want to see him strong again." The war chief's expression grew more serious. "What we do here, it is like planting seed in dry ground. May not grow, but without planting, certainly nothing grows." The analogy resonated deeply with Sarah, who had stubbornly cultivated her garden through drought and hardship. "Some seeds take time to sprout," she offered, "but are stronger for having pushed through difficult soil." Stonewolf nodded, seemingly satisfied with her understanding. Before returning to the porch, he added, "The boy carved another eagle. Say this one's for you to keep, not to give away as a token." From his pouch, he withdrew a third carving, smaller than the others, fashioned from rich red cedar wood. "He says red is for the lifeblood you saved." The simple gift from the boy whose rescue had catalyzed everything brought unexpected tears to Sarah's eyes. "Tell him I will treasure it," she said softly, "and that I look forward to seeing him at the next council." When they returned to the porch, Judge Brennan had completed his draft. By lantern light, the document was reviewed by both delegations, with Sarah occasionally clarifying terms that held different connotations in Comanche understanding. Finally, with quiet ceremony, The preliminary agreement was signed. Judge Brennan, Major Porter, and Captain Hayes representing Texas. Stone Wolf, Red Knife, and Black Elk marking for the Comanche bands. We have taken first steps on the new trail, Stone Wolf announced as the document was rolled and secured. Many more steps needed, many who will try to turn us back to old ways of fighting, but we have created a possibility where none existed before, Judge Brennan responded, extending his hand in the white man's gesture of agreement. After a moment's consideration, Stone Wolf accepted it, a symbolic bridging of cultural divide that matched the more substantive compromises outlined in their agreement. As the Comanche delegation prepared to depart, preferring to begin their journey back to their territories before full darkness, Stone Wolf addressed Sarah one final time. 30 days from now, another council, perhaps at Fort next time, to show our people we can enter your places and leave in peace. I'll be there, Sarah promised, standing on her porch as the chiefs mounted their horses. Captain Hayes moved to her side as they watched the Comanche delegation ride northward, eventually disappearing over the same ridge from which they had first emerged at dawn. You understand what you've helped create today may not survive its first real challenge, he said quietly. The forces aligned against peace are powerful on both sides. I understand, Sarah acknowledged. But having seen what's possible, how could I not try? Hayes nodded, his weathered face revealing grudging admiration. Governor will want to meet you when he hears Brennan's report. Wouldn't be surprised if he offers you a formal appointment as liaison to the Comanche. The suggestion startled Sarah, who had never envisioned her private act of mercy evolving into a public role. I'm just a widow, trying to keep my homestead viable through drought, she demurred. You're considerably more than that now, Hayes countered, gesturing toward the table where history had potentially been altered through words rather than weapons. Whether you sought it or not, you've become a symbol of what might be possible. As the Texas delegation prepared to depart the following morning, Sarah stood once more on her porch, the 3 carved eagles now displayed together on the simple shelf that held her most treasured possessions, alongside Thomas's watch and their wedding daguerreotype. Each represented a different facet of the extraordinary path she now walked. The original talisman given in gratitude for Taab's life, its matching token that verified official delegates, and the newest addition, a personal gift from a boy who had once been a frightened enemy in her care. I'll send word when the governor responds to our report, Judge Brennan promised as he boarded his carriage. Though I expect Captain Hayes will deliver news before my messenger arrives. Travel safely, Sarah replied, shaking the judge's offered hand. And please convey my respect to the governor for his willingness to explore this path. As the delegation's dust trail faded in the distance, Sarah turned back to the everyday tasks that sustained her homestead, feeding chickens, tending the garden that somehow continued to produce despite the drought, repairing the endless small damages that frontier life inflicted on human habitation. Yet as she worked, she found herself repeatedly glancing toward the northern ridge, where Comanche scouts occasionally appeared, a reminder that she existed now in a unique space between worlds, trusted and distrusted by both sides, her homestead transformed from anonymous frontier holding to potential cornerstone of a new relationship between peoples who had known only enmity for generations. The Eagle Token Council had taken its first tentative flight. Whether it would soar or plummet remained to be seen. But on this golden Texas afternoon, as Sarah Callahan continued the simple work that had sustained her through grief and isolation, she allowed herself to believe that mercy, extended at great risk across seemingly insurmountable divides, might yet prove stronger than the hatred that had defined the frontier for so long. From a dying Comanche boy to 60 warriors at dawn to a council of peace, the path had been neither straight nor certain, But it had begun with a choice to see the humanity in those she had been taught to fear, and that choice continued to ripple outward in ways no one, least of all Sarah herself, could have predicted. The seasons turned, and with them, the fragile peace took root and began to grow. 3 more councils followed the first, alternating between Sarah's homestead and the neutral ground of a meadow near Fort Mason. Each meeting built upon the foundation laid by its predecessors, addressing disputes before they escalated into violence, establishing protocols for handling transgressions on both sides, and gradually expanding the network of settlers and Comanche who supported the tentative alliance. Autumn brought the long-awaited rains, ending the drought that had parched the Texas hill country. Sarah's garden flourished with renewed vigor, producing enough surplus to trade at the growing settlement that had sprung up near the fort. The homestead that had once teetered on the edge of abandonment now thrived, not just from improved weather, but from its unique position in the changing frontier landscape. Governor Runnels formalized Sarah's role as liaison between Texas authorities and the Comanche bands, providing a modest stipend that eased her financial concerns. More valuable than money, however, was the official recognition that protected her from those who still viewed any cooperation with the Comanche as treason. Captain Hayes ensured that ranger patrols regularly included her property on their routes, a visible reminder that she operated with government sanction. On a crisp November morning, as Sarah inspected her expanding herd of cattle, now including several calves bred from Comanche stock, part of an exchange program Stonewolf had initiated, she spotted a familiar figure approaching from the north. Nighthawk, no longer just Stonewolf's messenger but a respected warrior in his own right, rode with the confident ease of someone who had made this journey many times. "The Eagle Woman returns." Sarah greeted him with the name the Comanche had given her, a reference to both the carved tokens and her role as one who saw across boundaries. Nighthawk dismounted with a smile that would have been unimaginable during their first tense meetings. "Stonewolf sends news. The Council of Chiefs has approved the trading agreement. They will bring horses to the winter meeting as promised." This development represented a significant milestone, a formal economic relationship. Beyond the immediate concerns of border security, the Comanche would provide their superior horses and hunting knowledge. The settlers would offer agricultural products and manufactured tools. Both sides would benefit from the other's strengths rather than suffering from their aggression. "That's welcome news," Sarah responded. "And how is Tabe? I had hoped to see him at the last council." Nighthawk's expression brightened further. "He completed his warrior training this season. Stonewolf says he may accompany the delegation in spring." He hesitated before adding, "The boy speaks often of you. He studies English words from traders, so he may talk with you himself when he comes." This simple detail, a Comanche youth learning the language of those he had been raised to view as enemies, specifically to communicate with the woman who had saved his life, moved Sarah deeply. In such small personal choices, the larger piece found its most meaningful expression. As winter settled over the Texas hill country, bringing crisp, clear days and star-filled nights, Sarah received an unexpected letter. The handwriting on the envelope was unfamiliar, the postmark from Washington City. Inside was a formal communication from the Department of Indian Affairs, requesting her presence at a congressional hearing on the Texas Comanche situation, scheduled for the following spring. Captain Hayes arrived the next day to explain the significance of the invitation. "The success of the Eagle Token Council has attracted attention in high places," he informed her as they sat before her fireplace. "Senator Henderson believes your testimony could influence Indian policy throughout the Western Territories." Sarah regarded the letter with mixed emotions. "I've never traveled beyond San Antonio, let alone to Washington. Judge Brennan would accompany you," Hayes assured her, and the government would cover all expenses. He studied her thoughtfully. Your perspective is unique, Sarah. You've accomplished what professional diplomats and military men failed to achieve for decades. I simply saved a boy's life, she demurred, echoing her response when others attributed greater motives to her actions. Everything else followed from that single choice. Hayes smiled slightly. Perhaps that's precisely the message Washington needs to hear. The prospect of such a journey, and the public testimony it would entail, occupied Sarah's thoughts through the quiet winter months. Her correspondence increased dramatically, with letters arriving not just from Texas officials, but from Eastern newspapers, and even a historian documenting frontier relations. The story of the woman who had saved a Comanche boy, only to have his father return with 60 warriors at dawn, had transcended local legend to become a narrative of national interest. More personally significant was the letter that arrived from Rebecca Miller in St. Louis, containing news that she had become engaged to a fellow teacher at the mission school. I never thought I would find happiness again after James, she wrote. But you showed me that life continues, even after great loss, and that new connections can form in the most unexpected circumstances. The letter concluded with an invitation for Sarah to visit whenever her travels might bring her northward. The Winter Council, held during a rare mild spell in January, brought together the largest gathering yet, 5 Comanche chiefs, representatives from 3 different bands, along with an expanded Texas delegation that now included 2 prominent settlers who had initially opposed the peace process, but had gradually been won over by its practical benefits. The promised horses were presented, their quality drawing admiration even from Major Porter, whose military skepticism had evolved into grudging respect for the Comanche's expertise in breeding and training. As the formal proceedings concluded, Stonewolf approached Sarah privately. "Something important to show you," he said, gesturing toward a young Comanche who waited at a respectful distance, partially obscured by the gathering dusk. When the figure stepped forward into the lantern, "Light!" Sarah's hand flew to her mouth in surprise. Though nearly 3 years had passed, she immediately recognized the boy, now a young man whose life she had saved beside her spring. "Tabe," she whispered, scarcely believing how much he had grown. The skinny, vulnerable child had developed into a lean, confident youth on the cusp of manhood. He wore the traditional dress of a Comanche nearing warrior status, his bearing proud, yet carrying none of the hostility that might once have been directed toward a settler woman. "Eagle woman," he greeted her, the English words carefully practiced. "I bring thanks for life you save." From a pouch at his waist, he withdrew a small object, a 4th carved eagle, this one fashioned from antler bone and inlaid with tiny turquoise eyes. "I make this myself, many moons of work." The craftsmanship was exquisite, far surpassing the earlier carvings in detail and artistry. Sarah accepted it with genuine emotion, recognizing that it represented not just gratitude for a past action, but hope for a continued relationship. "It's beautiful," she told him, consciously slowing her speech to help him understand. "I will treasure it always." Stonewolf watched this exchange with evident satisfaction. "My son insisted on coming before his time, said 3 winters too. Long to wait to thank the one who fought fever spirit for him." The war chief's expression grew more serious. "He will be among those who remember this peace we build when elders like me are gone to the spirit path." The significance of this generational bridge struck Sarah profoundly. What they were creating was not merely a temporary cessation of hostilities, but potentially the foundation for a different future. One in which Tabe and other young people on both sides might envision coexistence rather than endless conflict. As spring approached, bringing with it preparations for Sarah's journey to Washington, she found herself increasingly reflecting on the extraordinary path that had led from that drought-stricken summer day when she discovered a wounded boy to her current role as a recognized intermediary between worlds that had previously known only bloodshed. The 4 carved eagles now occupied a special shelf in her cabin, tangible reminders of transformation, both personal and public. From tokens of gratitude to symbols of official diplomacy to expressions of ongoing connection, they chronicled a journey none could have predicted. On the evening before her departure for San Antonio, where she would meet Judge Brennan to begin the long journey eastward, Sarah sat on her porch, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in brilliant hues. The homestead that had once represented simply her stubborn dedication to Thomas's dream had become something far more significant, a crossroads where 2 cultures had discovered, however tentatively, that alternatives to violence existed. She fingered the newest eagle carving, Taabe's gift, appreciating the countless hours of patient work it represented. Like the piece they were all building, it had been shaped gradually, with attention to detail and a vision of what might emerge from raw material. And like that piece, its beauty derived not from perfection, but from the visible evidence of human effort, the small marks of tools guided by hands determined to create rather than destroy. Whatever awaited in Washington, whatever challenges, still threatened the fragile accord between settlers and Comanche, Sarah Callahan carried with her the certainty that compassion could indeed forge unexpected paths through seemingly impenetrable barriers. From a single act of mercy had flowed consequences no one could have foreseen. The Eagle Token Council, the territorial agreements, the gradually expanding circle of those committed to finding alternatives to bloodshed. As darkness settled over the Texas Hill Country, Sarah's thoughts returned to Stonewolf's words from their first encounter. Not all change is the enemy. In that simple truth lay the seed of everything that had followed, and the hope for what might yet emerge as Taabe's generation grew to leadership in a landscape transformed not just by settlement, but by the recognition that mercy extended at great risk across seemingly insurmountable divides could indeed alter the course of history. 1 boy, 60 warriors, a frontier changed. And it had all begun with a choice made beside a spring on a drought-stricken Texas afternoon, a choice to see the humanity in those she had been taught to fear. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.